Welcome back to the Middle Tech Podcast. You got Logan Jones and Evan Knowles here. We've got some interesting stories to go over this week. First of which being this recently announced AppHarvest Bankruptcy. So we're going to be talking about some of the things that we've covered on this podcast in the past leading up to this bankruptcy, what it means for the company going forward. We're going to be talking about a very exciting solar project coming to an old coal mine in Kentucky. We're going to be talking about a new superconductor material that is being hailed as what could be one of the biggest physics discoveries in our lifetimes. And then we're going to be talking about women more at risk of having their jobs displaced by artificial intelligence. So a couple of really interesting stories to go over here. We're excited to get into them. Before we do that, as we do, I just want to remind everyone to subscribe to our channel, follow us at Middle Tech Pod. And before we dive in, we just want to get a quick word from our sponsors. Before highlighting our sponsors, we'd just like to state that the views and content shared on this platform do not necessarily reflect those of our show sponsors. Middle Tech is presented by KY Innovation, the Kentucky Cabinet for Economic Development's Office of Entrepreneurship. KY Innovation exists to support and develop Kentucky's startup ecosystem, and we are proud to be supported by an organization whose mission aligns so closely with ours. If you're a founder building in Kentucky, you need to check out the resources that KY Innovation has to offer. You can find more information by clicking the link in our show notes or going to kyinnovation.com. Middle Tech is sponsored by Bolt Marketing. Take your website to the next level with a website that's built to work. At Bolt Marketing, they're revolutionizing websites for small businesses that are affordable, customizable, and hassle-free. Whether you have a construction company, a boutique clothing store, or you own a hot yoga studio, they have options for you. Click the link in our show notes to explore their marketing options that can transform your marketing and grow your business. And as a personal note, Bolt Marketing built our website, and they were awesome to work with throughout the entire process. We highly recommend working with them. All right, Evan, to kick us off here, we want to cover this bankruptcy filing from AppHarvest. I do want to reference that we're following along the WKYT article here. So that's where a lot of these facts are coming from. If you want to kind of go back and read the article yourself, lots of news publications have put out details around this bankruptcy. But this is something we talked a lot about on this podcast. We kind of followed along from the very beginning with AppHarvest. We've been huge supporters of theirs, but we also try to be real about where the company was as we saw things like their cash burn rate and kind of saw the writing on the wall as unfortunately we inched to this point. So give us some of the details around this. Let's dive into the story.
Yeah. So if you track, balance sheet, income statement, and just some of the production issues they've had over the last several months, you could see this coming. So first, what is Chapter 11 bankruptcy? It's essentially when a business tries to reorganize and rehabilitate the company's financial affairs and basically emerge from that bankruptcy a stronger, a more financially viable company and take care of their creditors and anybody else that they have obligations to in the process. So we don't know what that's going to look like yet for AppHarvest. But let's look into some of the statements and facts that we know. So their CEO, Tony Martin, came out and said, AppHarvest board of directors and executive leadership evaluated several strategic alternatives to maximize value for all stakeholders prior to our Chapter 11 filing. However, this protection that it provides allows us to transition operation of our strategic plan, Project New Leaf, which has shown strong progress toward operational efficiencies resulting in higher sales, savings, and product quality. So they basically came out and said, hey, this is our best option. That was the CEO. And so during this process, in order to keep operations going, they got a loan from Equilibrium Capital, which will allow them to keep the operations in Moorhead, Richmond, and Somerset going during this process. So this is basically defined as the debtor in possession. AppHarvest is the debtor in possession in this situation during the Chapter 11 bankruptcy, which means that they are the company that is filed for bankruptcy that is allowed to continue operations of its business while restructuring. And so that's important because we got to make sure that the jobs are not displaced during this process and they have time to go through the bankruptcy and do it right. And so Chapter 11 also protects the company from other forms of litigation, which is also important because over the last couple of years, there have been several claims by shareholders of fraud, and those have been filed. So this is just, again, another unfortunate situation related to AppHarvest. Chapter 11, like they said, is what they advised, their board advised them to do, and they basically came out and said, hey, this is our best option. So we'll see what that means going forward. This is just starting the filing, and the case is going to take place in Texas. That court might be more friendly to the Chapter 11s. They might be known for that. Not sure why beyond that it would be in Texas, but we'll see what comes out of that.
Yeah, I mean, the AppHarvest story is not completely over yet, but I feel like we have learned a lot watching this company be built in this region. And one of the things that I just kind of want to bring up that I think is a good point that I've heard you talk about and we've had conversations about is the model of trying to use venture capital for a large agricultural development such as AppHarvest. So if you want to just speak on that dynamic briefly here, just around like supporting a business model of that type with venture capital versus, doing raising debt, I think that would be something that is a good takeaway just from how all of this transpired. And, you've written a great article about some of the other things at play with this story, but I think trying to pull out some learnings from this is one of the positives we can do.
Yeah, I mean, the main point that I'm still trying to figure out and wrap my head around is, why was the company financed in the way it was? It's shady, to be honest. Like, that is kind of a loose term there, but it is very shady. So that's something to consider is why was this company funded with so much capital in a way that no other farming company in history up to this point has been funded? VCs have no business, getting involved in the farming space. And the only reason I can figure that they would is that, they knew a SPAC was coming. And so there's just kind of, weird situations regarding, the way it was funding, where the funds came from, the ESG movement. So I'm sure as, time goes on and hopefully those questions are answered and we figure out, like you said, why was the company funded in that way? And what's that mean? Chapter 11, with these filings of fraud, but I don't know. It's not normal for a company in the farming space to be getting venture capital. We've had several experts, on the podcast talk about that. And so that's one of the reasons, they filed for bankruptcy is when you raise venture capital and you have such a timeline to perform and you got to have an exit for those that gave you money. The SPAC was a perfect opportunity to do that, and it shortens timelines. Normally farms grow, kind of very systematically, slower over time and use debt and create cash flow to pay off the debt. In this case, that didn't happen. They raised $1.5 billion in a very, very short period of time from, sources that, were very involved in, ESG. And I'm not sure that was a healthy way to grow a business.
Yeah. I think one of the things you called out in that article, last kind of point here, is it really was kind of a perfect storm of the way the market was to allow that amount of funding to happen. You had ESG and kind of this huge initiative of, some of these really large firms putting money into basically companies that were saying the right things, saying, we're operating sustainably, we're going after this kind of goal, which, you have to evaluate a company not only on that, but also on the financials. And is it a good business model? And then you also had the SPAC movement going on, which I think we're going to look back at SPACs as one of the most ridiculous things to ever occur in financial markets. I mean, to allow retail investors to invest in a company that had not made revenue yet. It's an unproven business model, and basically take on the same risks, but at a higher valuation than what the VCs would have bought into it for is ridiculous in my opinion.
One of the biggest questions I have that I'm sure we'll never get an answer to is how early in the cycle of the business and the business formation did they know that they were going to SPAC? And if it was really early in the business, maybe even when they conceived the business, I think that should be illegal. And I think there's something fraudulent there. Now, will it come out as fraud? No, because it's clearly something that the government allows as SPACs. But if they created the company, raised all that funding, raised the valuation to where it was, knowing the whole time that they were going to SPAC and have an exit, I don't think that should be legal. And I think that is the only way I could see these VCs and these funders getting involved is that they knew they had a quick exit. And if that quick exit wasn't there in the form of a SPAC, AppHarvest wouldn't exist. That's just a fact. So I'm not sure what's going to happen on that front, but that's just my kind of take on that.
Like you said, we're never going to know the answer to that. So that is speculation. That's our opinion. But anyway, I'm sure we'll continue to provide updates. This is not like the end of the AppHarvest story. Like I said, this is just a pretty significant financial move to get them to whatever the next chapter is. So we'll see where it goes from here. On to a more positive story. We've got a cool story coming from Kentucky. The Starfire mine, formerly one of the largest coal mines in the world, in the United States, will be the site of a new solar energy center. So once complete, the Bright Night Starfire Renewable Energy Center will have an 800 megawatt capacity, producing enough electricity to power over 170,000 households per year. So I think this is just a really cool project because it's actually something we talked about on the podcast probably 3 seasons ago. We had Adam Elin on of Elin Renewables, who is, involved in this project as well. But with the idea of taking these abandoned coal mines that had been used already, had the coal mine out of them, and transforming them into something that, is more renewable and sustainable, like these big solar installations. And so it represents a possible $1 billion infrastructure investment in Kentucky, which is incredible. It's going to take place over about 4 phases, with phase 1 construction beginning in 2025. But one of the coolest parts of this story is that Rivian, the electric car manufacturer, is actually involved in this project, as they have agreed to purchase 100 megawatts of renewable power from phase 1 through a power purchase agreement with Bright Night. So that's enough power, enough energy to power up to 450 million miles of renewable driving every year, or about 33,000 cars for a year. So I just love that Rivian is kind of, doing some cool stuff in Kentucky. We also reported a couple weeks ago that back in April, Rivian had announced, I believe it was a $10 million investment in Kentucky to, I think it was build a manufacturing facility, or part of a manufacturing facility here. So it's awesome to see them doing some cool stuff in the state of Kentucky. Rivian's probably one of my favorite electric vehicle car makers right now. I think the cars just look awesome.
Yeah,
so
I think their SUVs are some of the best looking cars there are.
I agree. So shout out to Angelo, one of our past guests, just because he's involved with Rivian. We were texting back and forth with him, and I always like giving him shout outs on this podcast. He is just excited to see Rivian doing some cool stuff in Kentucky as well. So any other points or things you want to add to that story before moving on?
No, I just think it's a cool story that, we powered the nation with coal and, creating electricity for homes. And now we're going to be doing the same with now solar on one of those old facilities. I just think it's a great story, and, energy's in our veins. And so we got to keep attracting, sustainable energy, which we're doing a great job of. And we got to keep doing it.
Yeah, I love that. We'll have to have Adam Elin back on here soon and get the update on how his company's doing as well. Okay, moving on to a story that's a little bit more speculative. So I want to preface it by saying that this is a very early paper that has been published coming out of a team in Korea. And they are claiming to synthesize a new material called LK99 that would represent one of the biggest physics breakthroughs in recent decades. And the reason it's such a big physics breakthrough is they have claimed to create a superconductor that works at room temperature and ambient pressure. So I'm going to keep this story very high level. I'm not a scientist. I don't have a science background. I just have a natural curiosity for these sorts of things. So I was very intrigued when I started seeing Twitter and social media kind of light up with news about this breakthrough. And so just to kind of cover what a superconductor is, a superconductor is typically used in things like nuclear reactors, fusion reactors specifically, to try and contain that fusion energy. They're used for very powerful magnets. They're used in things like quantum computers. So in a lot of ways, superconductors are what actually powers some of this really advanced tech that we're trying to get into as a society. And typically they're often impractical because superconductors have to operate under really really high pressure and really low temperature. And so the reason superconductors are also important is because it essentially allows electricity to flow frictionlessly through that material. And the reason this breakthrough is so important, when you start zooming out and thinking about how this could affect, our electricity grid and these emerging technologies, I'll reference a tweet thread from Alex Kaplan. So I would go look this up if you're interested in learning more about this. He started this tweet thread that got a ton of attention on Twitter, and he kind of puts it into perspective what's actually possible if this breakthrough is true and is able to be recreated by other teams, which caveat is not yet. It's brand new news. But he says 100 billion kilowatt hours of electricity are wasted on transmission losses each year in the U.S. alone. So that is electricity that is lost through running it through power lines that, there's a little bit of friction per se that causes you to lose some of that electricity as you're transferring it from one place to another. He says that's equivalent to 3 of our largest nuclear reactors running 24/7. And superconductivity enables lossless electricity transmission at high voltages and currents. So really, the reason I wanted to cover this is because this is one of those things that if it turns out to be true, what this team in Korea is claiming, it's going to be one of those advances in physics that unlocks some pretty wild possibilities. Just to name a few, Quantum computers, for example, I mentioned that these superconductors currently have to operate under very high pressure, very low temperatures. So imagine being able to have a quantum computer that can operate at room temperature. That would obviously be a very huge deal and really lower the kind of difficulty of being able to build technology like that. Also unproven, but we're just talking possibilities here. The other one being things like nuclear fusion reactors that have to rely on these superconductors to contain that fusion energy that they create within the reactor. It just opens up all sorts of different reactor designs. And then more simply than some of these emerging tech applications that it could have, just revolutionizing battery technology and our electric grid would have a massive, massive impact on society. So again, I'm excited about what I'm reading here, but I do want to state that this is unproven. So this is just came out this week. Kind of the next steps that we're going to see unfold from this are going to be teams trying to recreate the same results that this team in Korea published in their paper. But if it turns out to be true and it turns out to be as easy as what they have claimed in their paper, it is a really, really big deal. So it's something to follow along with. I know it's seems like it might be something that's pretty technical, but keep an eye on it. We'll see what happens. It'll either be a really big disappointment or it'll be something pretty incredible. So that is the news around the breakthrough in physics. Anything you want to add to that? You think it's cool, Evan?
That's all over my head. Sounds great.
Yeah, it's over my head too, but I'm curious about it. I think it's cool. All right, let's move on to the AI Edge segment. So AI Edge, stories, tips, and topics for gaining an edge with artificial intelligence. Speaking of gaining an edge, we want to make sure everyone is gaining an edge. And it seems like artificial intelligence, according to this study, is indicating that women are more at risk of AI replacing their job. So Evan, let's dive into this, break down what this report is saying, and let's talk about the dynamics of this.
Yeah, so AI job loss is something that, economists and, us as a society need to think a lot about, especially with generative AI that's come onto the scene over the last year or so. So women are apparently most at risk, according to a report by Bloomberg and Revilio Labs. And so here are some jobs that, women hold very large percentages of that are considered to be very exposed to AI. So bill and account collectors, payroll and timekeeping clerks, executive secretaries, word processors and typists, bookkeeping and accounting and audit clerks, interpreters and translators, writers and authors. So for instance, bill and account collectors are occupied by about 83% women, and AI is supposed to replace a very high percentage of those jobs. So this report is basically saying, hey, how do we make sure that there is considered some kind of equity considered as we roll out AI and make sure that women are not more exposed, and we got to figure out how to replace jobs with new ones if that is the case, so that women can continue to occupy jobs. And we don't have this weird scenario and very unfortunate scenario where women are more unemployed than men because of AI. So just something we need to think about as a society and as a business culture. So just something to consider.
Yeah, I think it's great to bring awareness to that sort of stuff. So other than that, I don't think I have a tip of the week. I've shared pretty much all my good tips over the past few weeks, so need to keep experimenting and figure out some new ones to give. Other than that, our Spotlight series is going to feature an interview with our friend Armando Diaz of Working with Saint. So be sure to check that out. We got a really cool recording setup for that one. So go check that out on YouTube. You'll be impressed by how far the Middle Tech podcast has come. Other than that, we hope you guys have a great week. We hope you enjoyed these stories, and we'll talk to you next week.